Time's the brief. These are the top stories of the day. Brought to you by TurboTax Tips. If you've ever wondered about the facts, fiction, and best practices when it comes to taxes, TurboTax Tips can help. With expert tips in 5 minutes or less, it's quick and easy to learn how to maximize your tax refund. Just search TurboTax Tips wherever you listen to podcasts. How foster families are stepping up to house unaccompanied children arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border by Jasmine Aguilera. Jay and Leslie, a couple who live in the Philadelphia area, have so far fostered 4 children this year, 3 boys and 1 girl, all of them migrants who arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border recently without their parents. The children are among the thousands who have showed up at the border since January, fleeing violence, poverty, or natural disaster in their home countries, hoping to reunite with loved ones in the U.S. The uptick of unaccompanied children presenting themselves at the border has proven a challenge not only for the Biden administration, but also for the dozens of nonprofit organizations that manage the transfer of children from the border and into temporary foster care until the child can be reunited with a vetted sponsor in the U.S. Even though influxes of unaccompanied children arriving at the border is not a new phenomenon, for most of 2020 the Trump administration did not permit them to enter the U.S., a policy that led many of the nonprofit organizations running programs to foster these children to either cut staff or the number of beds available to shelter children. COVID-19 also led to further restrictions, including cutting bed space to allow for social distancing. Now, as thousands of children, a mix of newly arrived ones and some who were turned away in 2020, present themselves to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, agencies are scrambling to meet the need. We saw a dramatic reduction of children in 2020. That does not mean that the number of children at the border weren't still there. They just weren't being allowed entry into the United States, says Donna Abbott, Senior Advisor on Global Refugee and Immigrant Services at Bethany Christian Services, one of the nonprofit organizations running transitional foster care programs for unaccompanied migrant children. Through organizations like Bethany, children are placed in foster care temporarily until their sponsor, typically a family member in the U.S., is located and their identity and relationship to the child is verified. Government officials say about 90% of all unaccompanied minors are able to reunite with a sponsor in the U.S. Hundreds of foster families have taken on the short-term care of migrant children through organizations like Bethany, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, 2 other faith-based organizations that assist with placing migrant children in temporary foster care. All 3 organizations, however, are trying to work as quickly as possible to hire qualified staff and get more foster families certified to take in migrant children to try to meet the current need. The bottom line is that we need to address an emergency situation of unaccompanied children coming across the border who have already been through so much and need our help now, says Krish Omara Vignaraja, President and CEO of LIRS. We saw similar spikes in 2014, 2016, and 2019. My hope is that we will learn from what feels like a roller coaster ride. This turbulence hurts vulnerable children. We can't keep building up the capacity and then decimating it. Because the government stopped receiving unaccompanied migrant children in March of 2020, the systems in place to quickly reunite children with their sponsors were gutted. The U.S.'s Title 42 rule immediately expelled anyone arriving at the border illegally or to make a claim for asylum because of the risks posed by COVID-19. In November of 2020, a judge determined that unaccompanied children should not be expelled under Title 42 after the ACLU sued the Trump administration. The Biden administration officially stopped expelling unaccompanied children, but has continued to expel family units back to Mexico, only processing them into the U.S. in cases where Mexico has run out of shelter space. What we're seeing is a lot of children who are victims of adults' decisions, Abbott says. That probably sums up every child's story at the border. You have all the children who have been there waiting because, as a country, we decided not to process them at the time they came to the border. In the meanwhile, the system that they would have entered into got dismantled. After fostering 1 child in March of 2020, a young girl from Ecuador, Jay and Leslie waited patiently for months to foster another child. The couple describes themselves as empty nesters with 2 grown sons in college. They have the space and time, and their faith compelled them to become foster parents, they tell Time. You have to have compassion for someone who is by themselves, not with their family, in a new environment, new language, new everything, Leslie says. You realize that you're their first link, their first stepping stone into the United States. It's a big responsibility. Time spoke to Leslie and Jay on the condition that their last names remain anonymous out of concern for their safety and the safety of the children they foster. It is politicized, Leslie says, adding that while she's never faced a contentious situation herself, another woman in the program had been yelled at by a stranger for fostering migrant children. Some people think if you're helping, you're contributing to the problem, which is totally not the case, but they're not supportive of people coming over the border. During a call on Thursday afternoon, government officials told reporters that the Department of Homeland Security was holding about 4,500 children. Children are required to pass through DHS custody within 72 hours and are then transferred to Health and Human Services, which oversees COVID-19 testing, quarantine, and the placement of children into temporary foster care through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. During the Thursday press call, officials said that HHS had approximately 9,500 children in its care as of Wednesday. Because of the high number of children, officials said some children end up staying in DHS custody longer than 72 hours. Temporary facilities have been built by DHS to house children in its custody temporarily, including a facility in Donna, Texas, that quickly became overcrowded. Officials also converted the K. Bailey Hutchison Convention Center in downtown Dallas into a holding facility for migrant teens. Additional facilities are being built in Texas and Arizona, officials said Thursday. On average, it takes 34 days before a child is reunited with their sponsor, according to government officials. High-ranking Republicans have quickly blamed the Biden administration for the crisis. During a Monday trip to El Paso, Texas, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy called the situation a human heartbreak and a crisis created by the policies of the Biden administration. Texas Governor Greg Abbott told Fox News that he has asked the Biden administration to allow Texas officials to speak to the children directly to see if they are victims of human trafficking, but his request was denied. ORR says all children are screened for trafficking when they are processed. In response, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas issued a lengthy statement on Tuesday saying, "As difficult as the border situation is now, we are addressing it. We have acted and we have made progress. We have no illusions about how hard it is, and we know it will take time. We will get it done. We will do so adhering to the law and our fundamental values. We have an incredibly dedicated and talented workforce." Jay and Leslie say they understand how highly politicized this influx of children has become, but add that they steer clear of the politics. What they see are children with pressing needs. They're also in a unique position to sometimes witness the reunification of a child with their loved one in the U.S. Jay's voice cracks when he talks about the first child he and Leslie ever fostered, and taking her to reunite with her mother already in the U.S. When the mom pulled up, the little girl looked up at us with a face almost like, "Can I go see her?" Jay says, choking up. She just goes running and jumps into her mom's arms. The girl's mom and stepfather had showed up with balloons and stuffed animals, plus presents for Jay and Leslie, a thank you for watching over their daughter. What an expert on evangelicals and sex says about the Atlanta shooter's claim he had a sex addiction, by Belinda Luscombe. On March 16th, a gunman shot 9 people in 3 Asian spas in Georgia and killed 8. The Atlanta Police Department said the shooter told them he was a sex addict and was seeking to eliminate the temptation that he perceived these outlets represented. It's not completely clear that sex work took place at the establishments he targeted. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms had suggested it didn't, but neighbors called the area in Atlanta where the spas were located a red light district. The police said they have not ruled out classifying the shooting as an anti-Asian hate crime. 6 of the women were Asian, and there has been a large uptick in anti-Asian violence in the last 12 months. But they have also noted that the gunman had frequented at least 2 of the establishments. According to the shooter's roommate, the shooter had sought treatment for his sex addiction at HopeQuest, a facility operated by an evangelical group and located just down the road from the first spa that he attacked in Ackworth, Georgia. The gunman was also a member of the evangelical Crabapple First Baptist Church in Milton, Georgia, which has begun the process to expel him and called the shootings the result of a sinful heart and depraved mind. It seems likely that a viper's nest of different toxic impulses lay behind the shooter's actions, but according to Samuel Perry, an associate professor of sociology at Oklahoma University who studies sex, race, gender, and faith, and author of 3 books about modern evangelical culture, including Addicted to Lust, the confusing rhetoric of the evangelical church about sex can lead to despair over a perceived sex addiction and a feeling that one must go to extremes to avoid it. He spoke to Time about his research. The shooter described himself as a sex addict. Is sex addiction a thing? It's not recognized as a thing in the psychiatric literature, even though it is talked about quite frequently. Some kind of a sexual compulsive disorder will be included in another forthcoming manual for mental health professionals, but it's different from the traditional sex addiction idea. It's describing more of a compulsion or an impulse control kind of issue. Why do some people regard themselves as sex addicts? Oftentimes, these things are difficult to disentangle from how somebody feels about their sexual behavior because there's very morally charged responses to it. There are all kinds of cultural values that are entangled with how one is evaluating one's own sexual behavior. There is an entire subculture around this idea of sex addiction and pornography addiction. I do think there are extreme situations in which people seem to be characterized by what we would consider a clinical addiction, some kind of dysregulated, out-of-control behavior, like compulsive gamblers have, ruining their lives systematically by their addiction. That usually is not going on when Christian men like the shooter describe their behavior as an addiction. Oftentimes, what they really mean is, I'm regularly engaging in this thing that I'd rather not, but I'm doing it consistently, so I feel like I'm out of control. Your research has suggested that there are some Christians who feel like they have a sexual addiction when, in fact, their sexual practices would be called normal by other people. Why is that? We have data collected in February where we asked adults how often they look at pornography, and when we asked them whether or not they think they're addicted to pornography, men who identify as evangelical Christians are considerably less likely to look at porn on a regular basis than men who are not evangelicals, but they are a third more likely to say that they're addicted to porn. That suggests that evangelicals are working with a very expansive definition of addiction that is basically shaped by this idea that if I'm doing something regularly that I'd rather not do, I can call myself an addict. And that's a core aspect of their identity. I'm a porn addict, or I'm a sex addict. It works differently among white liberal Protestants or white Catholics or secular people. There's a subculture around evangelicalism that kind of throws around the term addiction. I'm not a porn apologist. I don't think there's much good that comes from it, and yet white evangelical Christians are the most likely group of all the religious traditions to say that they are depressed when they look at porn, and that they look at porn more often than they want to, and they hide their porn use. What all of that suggests to me is that there is an anxiety and distress around someone's moral violation of their sexual ethic or values that leads to a really negative self-characterization as somebody who is powerless. Are there other beliefs that often coexist with these beliefs that people are addicted to sex or pornography in these Christian circles? One of these interesting paradoxes among conservative Christian men is that sexual sin is a really bad sin, and that you can reduce your entire spiritual life to how you're doing sexually. It's something I call sexual exceptionalism in my book, the idea that for evangelicals, oftentimes sexual sin is the worst sin, not racism, not greed, not lack of love for your neighbor. It's what you're lusting over. But on the other hand, the culture of white evangelical masculinity says it's normal. This is something that is very, very normal for a guy to wrestle with. And in fact, if you weren't struggling with it as a guy, you'd be kind of weird. And so on the one hand, it's a really bad thing. And on the other hand, it's kind of what makes you a guy. It's normalized that way, and people have conversations about it, and you get into accountability groups, and this is where you get affirmed as a man. I don't mean to say you are patted on the back for sexually sinning, they feel horrible about it. But on the one hand, it's condemning. On the other hand, it's kind of affirming. How much do you think the evangelical churches are responsible for promoting these beliefs, that this is something that is outside the men's control and dangerous? The rhetoric of addiction obscures more than it helps, because a lot of what these men are struggling with is shame and guilt. About 70% of white evangelical men say they hide their porn use. Again, I'm not advocating pornography, but there is another level of self-flagellation and self-condemnation and negatively defining one's own identity as a porn addict that doesn't help these men. And sometimes women find healing and a sense of empowerment that they can direct their sexual urges in more positive ways. The subculture of evangelical purity culture says this is an addiction like heroin is an addiction. You need to be so serious about this violation in your life that you're willing to go to extremes to avoid it. And that's where it gets a little bit worrisome. When the New Testament talks about gouging out your eye and cutting off your hand in order to avoid lust, the implication is, I need to be willing to do anything to avoid this kind of sin. Now, do I think that drove this guy to commit murder? There are mental health issues, there's racism, there's all of these kinds of different factors mixed in there. And yet this kind of rhetoric surrounding sex addiction, I think it escalates it. Does this rule out the possibility that these were anti-Asian hate crimes? I think it was racialized, obviously. By frequenting these establishments, he's already expressing a racialized fetish for Asian women. He walked in that door knowing that they would be Asian faces he would be shooting. He had dehumanized this entire group of people. I don't know if there's any evidence to suggest that it was like, I hate all Asian people, and so I'm going to attack these women. Would he have killed a business establishment full of white women? Would he have dehumanized them in that way? Would he have gone to that establishment in the first place because he wouldn't have fetishized them in that way? There are racial implications that go beyond just, I hate all Asian people. He fetishized, objectified, and dehumanized Asian women in particular, and that plays a role. What should people be on the lookout for among their friends, among their family, and maybe even in their churches? Was there some tendency that those around him could have spotted? What I suggest in my book, Addicted to Lust, is that there has got to be a culture built around just having conversations about what is going on in that department and destigmatizing it. I'm not saying that they should be okay with porn or sex work, but there's got to be a better culture surrounding talking about it so that people don't feel like they have to bury that so far down. Asian American religious leaders reflect on the Atlanta shootings, by Ann Most. Anti-Asian hate crimes are on the rise in the United States. The most recent March 16th shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, left 8 people dead, many of them Asian women. As Asian Americans process a gunman opening fire on 3 Asian-owned spas, many will turn to leaders in their communities. Time spoke with Asian American religious leaders to reflect on Tuesday's shootings. Pastors Peter Lim and Andrew Song of 4 Points Church of Atlanta and Minister Hee Sung Shin of Atlanta Chinese Christian Church North discussed how they are processing the tragedy and how they plan on leading their communities forward to heal. My role as a pastor is to not only create a space for people to mourn and lament, but my role as a pastor is also to advocate, Pastor Lim said. They explained that while they are still processing their own feelings, staying silent is not an option for the Asian American community. What has happened in this past week has become the proverbial straw, Pastor Song said. We can't just let it go from now on. For more on this story, there's a video embedded in this article at time.com. American democracy can't survive unless the far right is marginalized. Here's how to do it. By Lee Drutman. Drutman is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America, author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America, and co-host of the Politics in Question podcast. As our nation comes to grip with the horrific events of January 6th and watches the Republican Party descend further into Trumpism as it pushes hundreds of restrictive voting laws across the country, the obvious question is, How does American democracy come back from all this? There is a path forward. The supermajority of Americans across the political spectrum who reject the extremism need to come together. This includes the pro-democracy right. But for the pro-democracy right to thrive, we need to reform the U.S. voting system to allow for new parties to emerge outside the existing two-party system. Without electoral reform, third parties are likely to fail as spoilers, but only a new small L liberal Republican Party, distinct from the increasingly illiberal Trumpist GOP, can establish a new partisan identity that gives center-right voters a meaningful home. Only a new party can create a distinct pathway to elected office that avoids the combatively hyper-partisan Republican primary voters. A party faction cannot do these things. Left to fight a losing battle in the Republican Party, as the recent CPAC confirmed, the withering pro-democracy faction is up against frightening odds. Electoral reforms that make space for more parties may seem unlikely, but urgent times call for big changes, and American democracy has done big things before. First, we need to understand the urgency of the problem. By international standards, the current Republican Party is an illiberal, anti-democratic, nativist global outlier with positions more extreme than France's National Rally and in line with the Germany's AfD, Hungary's Fidesz, Turkey's AKP, and Poland's PIS, according to the widely respected VDEM Varieties of Democracy Institute. This is not a new problem. The GOP has been sliding into authoritarianism over 2 decades, using increasingly demonizing rhetoric against its opponents. But it got worse under Trump's leadership and the failure of center-right factions to push back. We are running out of time. What happens in a hyper-polarized party system when a major party turns against the entire system of legitimate elections? Historically, democracy dies. And yet, if recent months and weeks have highlighted the dangerous extremism of the current Republican Party, they've also shown how broadly unpopular such violent extremism actually is. 3/4 of Americans disapprove of the January 6th mob's actions, and Trump's seemingly immovable approval floor dropped by about more than 6 points. In the days after, only 13% of Americans considered themselves Trump supporters, while another 16% considered themselves traditional Republicans. If Trump supporters were their own party, they'd be about as popular as Germany's far-right AfD, which polled at about 15% for 2019, though their support more recently dropped off to 11%. But the obvious difference is that in Germany, the popular center-right CDU party, headed by Angela Merkel, was able to form a governing coalition with the center-left, keeping the AfD far away from power. In the U.S., where governing power can fall to a mere plurality of a plurality, the center-right has been overwhelmed by the far-right in the Republican Party. And because the U.S. has a two-party system, the center-right is largely homeless. If fighting for a place in the GOP is pushing a heavy rock up a steep hill, fighting for a place in the Democratic Party is pushing an even heavier rock up the side of a cliff. But why is the United States a two-party system? It's not because voters want just two parties. For decades, majorities of Americans have told pollsters they want more parties to choose from and registered their dissatisfaction with the two-party system by increasingly identifying as independents. Rather, it's because the U.S. uses a system of first-past-the-post single-winner plurality elections for Congress. In such a system, votes for third parties are wasted and third parties are dismissed as spoilers. All ambitious politicians, thus, set their sights on one of the two major parties. And because anybody can run in a party primary, parties have very little control of their candidates. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, was not selected by Republican Party leaders. She simply won her primary with the support of just 43,813 voters in a district of almost 700,000 residents. Instead of being a minor party candidate, she is now an increasingly prominent Republican. The U.S. is the only advanced democracy to give voters full control over party primary nominations. In every other advanced democracy, party leaders control nominations. The U.S. is also the only genuine two-party system among advanced democracies, and absent major reform, that's not likely to change anytime soon. Historically, the U.S. two-party system functioned reasonably well only because it operated more like a four-party system, with liberal Republicans, largely from New England and the West Coast, and conservative Democrats, largely from the South and the Mountain West, elected alongside conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. In this four-party system, parties operated like overlapping coalitions instead of opposing armies. Politics was more local and less national. These overlapping parties, rooted in more local political cultures, meant more bargaining in Congress, and because both parties had liberal and conservative wings, they wound up both being moderate overall, reducing the stakes of national elections and the potential for demonizing the other side as radical. Take the 1990 Clean Air Act, one of the last major, truly bipartisan bills that came out of Congress, which brought together Democrats, environmental activists, with pro-market Republicans for a bill that passed overwhelmingly. But as the two parties began sorting more clearly along liberal-conservative lines as culture war issues starting in the 1970s, and as American politics nationalized around these cultural issues, and starting in the 1990s, as the longtime Democratic control of the House ended, every election became a high-stakes all-or-nothing fight for control of federal power. In this high-stakes nationalized context, the liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, who had been the hinge groups in shifting policy coalitions, were the casualties. The differences between the parties became sharper as the overlap vanished. With its liberal wing marginalized, the GOP became much more conservative and rural, dominated by evangelical whites who saw their social status declining and whose hold on political power increasingly came to depend on counter-majoritarian institutions like the Senate and on voting rules that limited the franchise of Democratic constituencies. Fueled by grievance, dominated by reactionaries, the party became more anti-system, more distrustful of the establishment, and more receptive to the racist demagoguery and wild conspiracies that now dominates the party and led to the rise of Donald Trump. Even if most Americans may reject this extremism, the constrained geography of the right gives this ideology a firm hold on the Republican Party. And in a two-party system, the Republicans still remain the only alternative for those uncomfortable with the Democrats. The only way to elevate the moderate Republicans is for Congress to use its constitutional authority, Article 1, Section 4, to change how we vote and create electoral opportunities for a center-right to rise again. In the House, this would mean multi-member districts with ranked choice voting, combine existing districts into larger ones, ideally 5 members, let voters rank candidates, and send the top 5 winners to Congress. Massachusetts and Maryland could start sending more Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan-type center-right representatives to Congress, and Kansas and Oklahoma could start sending more center-left representatives to Congress. In the Senate, elections could operate like Maine and Alaska now do, with ranked choice voting. This will encourage more moderate, coalition-minded senators to emerge. The combination of these two electoral reforms will open space for more parties, and especially for a new center-right. Ideally, we should also pass a constitutional amendment to elect the president in a 2-round system using the national popular vote. But the congressional election reforms require only legislation, so they should have top priority. The threats to American democracy are terrifying, but the good news is that a supermajority of Americans consistently reject the tear-it-all-down extremism. The bad news, however, is our two-party system presents a major obstacle to that supermajority asserting itself. Electoral reform to allow multi-party democracy is an urgent necessity. If it's Democrats versus Republicans, American democracy is in deep trouble. But if it's small L liberals versus illiberal extremists, we might yet survive. And the most likely way to achieve this urgent realignment is to change the voting system to break up the two-party binary. Mads Mikkelsen can do anything, but he's stuck in the boring Oscar-nominated Another Round. by Stephanie Zacharik. Pointless films have their place in the world. Not every movie has to clue us into some murky corner of human nature, or teach us about worlds different from our own, or make us see our own lives in a fresh light. But even within that context, it's hard to know what purpose Another Round, a half-comedy from the generally very serious Danish director Thomas Vinterberg, is supposed to serve. Most notably, Another Round, which is currently available to stream, is up for not one but 2 Academy Awards, Best International Feature and Best Achievement in Directing. Another Round isn't badly directed. If anything, it's rather skillfully put together, especially as a showcase for Mads Mikkelsen, a wondrous actor who can pretty much do no wrong. But Mikkelsen's command over the whole enterprise notwithstanding, the question remains, why does this movie even exist? Mikkelsen plays a mousy, sad-looking schoolteacher, Martin, whose personality is so lackluster that his students, teenagers gearing up for graduation, have begun to complain about him. They are worried that what they call his indifference will endanger their ability to pass their exams. The logic of their argument is unclear. He's not a negligent teacher, just a boring one, but the movie demands we accept their complaint as a serious problem. At home, Martin's 2 teenage sons slouch in front of the TV, looking through him as if he were a specter. When Martin asks his attractive, blasé wife, Annika, played by Maria Bonnevie, if he's become boring, she responds, her tone laced with pity masquerading as kindness, with the ego shrinker of all time. "You're not the same Martin I first met." This is very funny in a dour, humorless way. Not for nothing was Vinterberg one of the godfathers of Dogma 95, the rigid but hip set of filmmaking rules that caused a mild kerfuffle in the filmmaking world some 25 years ago. But even in the midst of our knowing arty-farty laughter, we can see that Martin is drowning in his own drabness. At a birthday celebration with his 4 closest male friends, all of whom teach at the school, birthday boy Nikolaj, played by Magnus Malang, diagnoses his problem succinctly. "I think you lacked self-confidence and joy." But Nikolaj has a solution, not just for Martin, but for all of them. Drinking on the job. There are rules. Imbibing in the morning is recommended, in fact encouraged, but everyone must stop at 8 in the evening, the regimen favored by Ernest Hemingway, and no one should consume enough to get knee-walking drunk, at least not at first. This manly experiment is intended to test the theory of real-life Norwegian psychiatrist Finn Skåderud, who has asserted that the normal blood alcohol level of human beings is just too low. The suggestion is that we'd all be better off if we went through life slightly drunk. And guess what? It's sort of true, at least for Martin, and at least at first, he miraculously becomes a much looser, livelier, cooler teacher. But the benefits reaped by his friends, especially phys ed teacher Tommy, played by Vinterberg regular Thomas Bo Larsen, are more questionable. And the stakes rise all around when Nikolaj decides to escalate the group's Skårderudian experiment. If Another Round had been presented as a farce, a trifle, it might, paradoxically enough, carry more weight. Good comedies have a way of cutting deep, maybe because they relax us just enough so that we let down our guard. But Another Round is both too serious and not serious enough. Its tone is fully adult and respectable. It feels like an experiment itself, a little rubber mallet designed to test our, is it a comedy or is it a drama, reflexes. But as I watched, I felt nothing beyond the persistent, inquisitive tinniness of that hammer tap. On the one hand, it's a relief that Another Round isn't the bleak downer you think it's going to be, a story about a man ruined by alcoholism. Its chief focus, beyond being a celebration of male friendship and communal inebriation, is the mild tragedy of middle-aged invisibility. Women often complain about that, but men feel it too. We should be grateful also that this is one of Vinterberg's more lighthearted affairs. There are no false accusations of child molestation and no dead dogs, as in The Hunt, and no scrappy heroine working overtime to advertise the modern-day relevance of Thomas Hardy, as in Vinterberg's uneven adaptation of Far from the Madding Crowd. And at least we've got Mikkelsen. In addition to being Vinterberg's key actor, the Danish star has played a James Bond villain and Hannibal Lecter, as well as a so-called accountant in a Rihanna video, but he can clearly do anything. Even here, as a character with no discernible personality, Mikkelsen casts a sympathetic, believable shadow. His Martin is a nowhere man of great distinction, stuck in a nowheresville of a movie. This has been Time's The Brief. For more stories, visit time.com.